The Year of the Black Pony by Walt Morey, Chapter 11. For several days I lay flat on my back on the bed, or sat in a chair with my foot propped up. But Lucifer's bucking off had accomplished one good thing. That void between Ma and me was gone. Her attitude toward Lucifer had changed too. She was against him more than ever now. Luckily, Frank had finished his work for Fletcher and took over all my chores. He let Lucifer run in the corral. When I asked about him, Frank said, "He's as easy to be around as any old saddle horse I've ever seen." "That means nothing," Ma said sharply. "It's what will happen the second you try to ride him." "I know," Frank agreed. The third morning, the bandage came off my head, and that afternoon the swelling had gone down enough in my ankle to get a shoe on. I immediately hobbled out to see Lucifer. He welcomed me with nickering and tossing his head and pushing against me like he was glad to see me. I spent an hour talking to him, petting and fussing around him. He acted like anybody could step right up and climb on his back, and there'd be no trouble. Frank came in from checking the alfalfa field, and I asked, "Do you really think he can be broke to ride?" Frank leaned on the gate and studied Lucifer. "I thought so when I got him. Now I'm not so sure." "Why?" I asked. "Look at him. He obviously likes you. You'd think all you had to do was climb aboard and he'd walk off like an old farm plug. But he tossed you all over that meadow. Not once, 4 times. He knew exactly what he was doing. He could be a plain outlaw that's never going to be ridden. I've never been around an animal like him." "What you're saying is that you're afraid he can't be broken to ride," I said with a sinking feeling. Frank shook his head. "I don't know what I'm saying. I'm no horse expert. I'm hoping that maybe we just haven't yet found the proper way to approach him." I was about to ask what would happen to Lucifer if he couldn't be ridden. Then I remembered Frank's words the night he brought me home. If he couldn't break Lucifer, he'd try to find a buyer or dispose of him. I knew what that meant. Shoot him. "As soon as we get this next cutting of alfalfa in, we'll really go to work on Lucifer and try to break him. The cutting's ready now. I'll mow tomorrow. Do you think you can rake in a couple of days?" "I'm ready now," I said. Frank mowed the next day, and 2 days later I raked it. The foot was as good as ever. It took 3 days to haul the hay in out of the field and stack it. Then Frank said, "Now we'll go to work on Lucifer." He drove to Fletcher's and borrowed a saddle. "Do you really think you can ride him?" Ma asked. "I'm no great shakes as a rider," Frank said, "but somebody's got to try it if he's going to be broke." "You be mighty careful. We don't need any broken arms and legs." "I intend to be careful," Frank said. The next morning, after we'd finished the chores, we started in. Frank went into the stall to saddle Lucifer. At the sight of the saddle, his ears shot forward, his head came up, and he began stamping back and forth. Frank put the saddle down. He knows what it is. He laid the saddle blanket over Lucifer's back. The pony moved about nervously for a minute, but when nothing else happened, he quieted down. Frank left the blanket on a few minutes, then removed it, waited, and replaced it again. He kept doing that while I stood at his head, talked to him, and petted. Finally, he accepted the blanket. Then Frank tried the saddle again. The moment its weight settled on his back, he swung his head. "It's all right," I said. "Easy, boy." His attention came back to me, and Frank left the saddle sitting loosely without trying to cinch it up. A few minutes later, Frank carefully drew up the cinch. Lucifer didn't object. "All right," Frank said. "Back him out and lead him around the corral. Keep his attention so he's not thinking about what's on his back." I did, and Lucifer followed me just fine. Ellie stuck her head between the corral rails and said, "Gee, Chris, he don't pay any attention to the saddle at all. You gonna ride him now?" Her sudden appearance and her sharp voice startled Lucifer, and he jerked his head up. "Get out of here," I hissed. "Beat it." I began talking to Lucifer, and he quieted down again. When I glanced up, Ellie was gone. She was standing on the porch with Ma. Ma was shading her eyes and watching us. I said, "I bet I could ride him now with the saddle on." "You've taken your lumps," Frank said. "When I figure the time is right, I'll do it. Take him back to the stall now." Frank left the saddle on for several hours so he'd get used to the feel of it and realize that just because it was there, something bad wasn't going to happen to him. Then he took it off. We repeated the performance in the afternoon. You think that will help? Ma asked. I don't know, Frank said, but saddling him and then piling aboard hasn't worked. Next morning we went through the same procedure, but this time we left him tied to the snubbing post with the saddle on when we went into lunch. Ellie asked immediately, when you going to ride him, Chris? I'm not, I said. Frank is. Right after lunch, Frank told her. You think he's ready now? Ma asked. He's about as ready as he'll ever be. I don't see anything to be gained by waiting longer. That sounds a little like now or never, Ma said. I guess it is. He's about as tame and gentle as a horse can get. At least that's how he acts with Chris. If he can't be ridden now, he never will be. I did not like the sound of that. The implications scared me so bad I could hardly eat. When we started to leave the house, Ma said, You be careful. I've seen that animal buck. I expect to see it very soon now, Frank said. He didn't try right away. He fiddled with the saddle, tightened the cinch, put one foot gingerly in the stirrup, and let his weight come on it. Lucifer looked around, but I was at his head talking to him, petting him. We spent almost an hour fooling with him, and then Frank said, I guess this is as good a time as any. Stand clear, Chris. I backed off as far as the water trough, and then I noticed that Ma and Ellie had come down and were leaning on the corral gate watching. Frank gathered up the reins, got hold of the horn, and carefully put a foot in the stirrup. I caught myself saying under my breath, Please be good, Lucifer. Please be good. Please, Lucifer. Frank went up in the saddle in a smooth lift. That instant, Lucifer exploded. His head was down between his forefeet, and he shot into the air as if on springs. I've never seen anything as wild. Frank lost his hat the first jump, and he whipped around on Lucifer's back like a rag. He stuck 3 more jumps, then he sailed into the air and landed hard on hands and knees. Lucifer stopped immediately and stood looking at him, ears cocked forward. I ran and picked up the reins. I felt a little sick. Ma had started through the gate to go to Frank when he slowly got on his feet and dusted off his pants. Man, oh man, he shook his head. I've ridden a couple of buckers in my younger days, but nothing like this hunk of dynamite. Ma asked, Are you all right? Are you sure you're all right? I'm fine, he said, except for my dignity. He took the reins from my hand. At least I know what to expect now. He stroked Lucifer's glistening shoulder. Then he took hold of the saddle horn and grinned at me. If at first you don't succeed. You're not going to try again, Ma asked. Mabel? He jerked his head at the saddle. There's only one place you can ride him from. Get back outside the gate and you back off, Chris. He went into the saddle fast, but as fast as he was, Lucifer was faster. His head was down and he was in the air, his back humped before Frank had both feet in the stirrups. He tried to bring Lucifer's head up, but he didn't have a chance. He lasted about as long as he had the first time. The moment Frank left the saddle, Lucifer stopped bucking as if his job were done. I picked up the reins again and held him. Frank was slower getting up this time. Then he leaned against the snubbing post, getting his breath. Ma ran to him and took his arm. That's enough, she said. He'll kill you. He threw you awfully hard that time. I'm all right, Frank managed, but I don't know. He smiled a little. There was a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. Maybe you're right and he can't be ridden. I said fearfully, You're not going to quit. You're not giving up. Let's say I'm beginning to have a few healthy doubts. Ma was looking at Lucifer, nibbling thoughtfully at the tip of her finger. Maybe you aren't going about this the right way. To break a horse, somebody's got to ride him, Frank pointed out, and that's where I seem to be having a bit of trouble. That's what I mean, Ma said. I watched each time you started to get on. He was ready and waiting for you. His mind was made up to buck, and he started immediately before you were firmly settled in the saddle. You didn't get a chance to pull his head up. A horse can't buck until he gets his head down. Where did you get all this horse knowledge? Frank asked. I told you I was raised on a farm in the East. My father was very good with horses. He probably broke half the horses in our county. It was his way of earning extra money. I've heard him talk about horses many times, and the things he did with a particularly bad one. What do you suppose he'd have done with this one? Father always said a horse had a one-track mind. Lucifer knows you're going to try to ride him, and he's just waiting for you to make your move. Then he beats you to it. He does that all right. How would you suggest I take his mind off tossing me sky high? Give him something else to think about. Like what? He's pretty set on dumping me. Ma nibbled thoughtfully at the tip of her finger. You might try dropping a pebble in his ear. You mean a rock? You're joking. Father broke a horse like this once. That's what he did. Of course, the pebble has to be big enough so it won't go down far into the ear, only the outer ear, Ma explained. You have to time it just right and drop the pebble in at the moment you mount. He immediately begins tossing his head to get rid of it. It takes his mind off anything else. By the time he gets the pebble out, you should be well set in the saddle and ready for him. That's pretty far-fetched. It worked for Father. You're not getting anywhere the way you're going at it now. All right, Frank agreed. I can't take many more spills like these. Chris, find me a rock about an inch or so in diameter. I found two. He took one and said, keep the other for an emergency. Then Ma and I stepped back and let Frank go at it. He gathered up the reins and Lucifer stood quietly, waiting, ears back, head turned slightly, watching Frank. At the last moment, Frank dropped the stone into his ear and at the same motion vaulted into the saddle. Lucifer began shaking and jerking his head like mad, trying to get rid of the stone. In a second or two, it popped out. Frank was ready for him. Those big hands had the pony's head up, and no matter how he tried, he couldn't get it down. They fought all over the corral, raising a dust cloud, but Frank kept his head high. Lucifer was streaked with sweat and clearly tired when he finally stopped, at a loss for what to do. Frank said, open the gate. Ma swung the gate wide. Lucifer danced through and they went out across the pasture, the pony fighting Frank all the way. They were gone about 20 minutes. When they returned, Lucifer was still trying to get his head down to buck, but it didn't seem to me he was fighting quite as hard as before. Frank stepped down and handed me the reins. I think you're going to have a working horse here, Chris. He smiled, but he's not ready for you to ride yet. Ma, I said excitedly, you hear that? He's going to be worth something. Ma studied Lucifer critically, arms folded. By her expression, I couldn't tell if she were pleased, displeased, or what. I think you're right, she said. Then she turned and went in the house. We took the saddle off. I rubbed Lucifer down, gave him a big feed of oats, and curried and brushed and talked to him. In a half hour or so, he quieted down. Frank rode him again later that day and used the pebble again. It went as it had before. Lucifer gave him a battle, but it didn't last as long as the morning one had. Frank rode him again the next day. Then he let me try it. I purposely went right up to the porch and yelled for Ma. She and Ellie came out. Ellie said, gee, you ain't scared he'll throw you? Course not, I said. He's just like riding Nellie now, only more fun. Lucifer snorted delicately. He tossed his head and stamped his feet. His sharp ears jumped back and forth. See, Ma, I said, he's a working horse now. Maybe, Ma said thoughtfully. He looks pretty fractious to me. It's just his way. He's full of life. I don't trust him, Ma said in a positive voice. You be mighty careful. I knew then there was no convincing her. She didn't like Lucifer, and nothing was going to change her. That afternoon, Frank took the saddle back to Fletcher's. In the following weeks, before school started back, I rode everywhere, bareback. I even went into town. Sheriff Ed Peck and Mr. Wright came out of the store to look at Lucifer. The sheriff said, you got a mighty nice-looking pony there. That couldn't be Sam Fletcher's black bucker, could it? He was. I was so proud I was ready to bust. He's mine now. And you're riding him. The sheriff smiled at me. You're quite a buckaroo as well as a fighter. Frank broke him, I said. Mr. Wright adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and peered close at Lucifer. A boy riding Sam Fletcher's bucker. I swan to man, I wouldn't have believed it. Well, well. I went into the store to get some groceries Ma wanted. And while Mr. Wright was filling the order, I slipped down to the gun department. The little single-shot .22 rifle was still there. Lucifer never did really quiet down and plug along like Nellie. His head was always high, his ears jumping back and forth, his nostrils flared, and he snorted delicately as he pranced along, looking like he was about to bust loose any second. I loved all that, but Ma didn't, so her distrust continued. The morning school started. Ma wouldn't let us ride Lucifer double, so Ellie rode Nellie. You stay with Ellie, Ma cautioned me, and don't let that black Satan get Nellie excited. We poked along side by side, Nellie head down, taking her time, Lucifer dancing and acting like he wanted to take off in a headlong run. That fall, I was in the 8th grade.